Hello everyone and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Whittaker, and this week we're talking about quite a few stories, but we're going to start with this story, which is Trump in the market for a new Japan Prime Minister? Is he looking for an alternative to Ishiba? And I raise that because there's a story that emerged this week concerning Sanae, and she was the candidate who very narrowly lost out to Ishiba in the race to become the head of the LDP and Japan's next Prime Minister. In the end, she lost in the runoff to Ishiba, who's now the Prime Minister. And as you might recall, there was a story earlier in the year where Trump is potentially accused to have snubbed Ishiba. He was there in, I think, Los Angeles refueling, and I think there was discussions about them having a meeting. But Trump essentially, I think, begged off. He either couldn't make the time, said he was busy, or said it wasn't quite right because he shouldn't be meeting a world leader before he'd been inaugurated, although he's, I believe, since met other world leaders before he was inaugurated. But in any case, the two never got together. And this was a little bit of a news story that Japan, obviously the alliance with the US is so key, and Trump and Ishiba hadn't met, was quite a story. But now Tachi has come out and said that she, last year, was invited to meet Trump and declined. And the reason she said she turned down this invitation is that she felt it was wrong of her as a member of the LDP, as a politician, but not Japan's Prime Minister, to meet Trump, because Trump should be meeting Ishiba first. And so on the one hand, you could see her turning that invitation down as an act of loyalty, saying, no, I can't be meeting Trump as an alternative LDP politician. He has to be meeting Ishiba first. But also, even saying this out loud and revealing that story, you could argue puts a degree of pressure on Ishiba. I believe the two still haven't met yet, and this puts additional pressure on that eventual meeting. I suppose you could make the argument that this is perhaps easier for him to meet. She's not the leader of the LDP, and so there's no question of him engaging in diplomacy or sort of high-level politics before he's been inaugurated, and the Logan Act and things like that. But I think that's maybe a little bit of a thin excuse because, like I say, Trump has met with other world leaders before he was inaugurated, and this seems to be a little bit of a pattern with Trump. Abe, who of course was from the Abe faction of the LDP, who Ishiba is not. He's more of an outsider within the LDP, and the Abe faction is sort of now out of power. It's on the outs after a couple of scandals. This seems to be a little bit of a pattern of Trump, where he sort of has very fond memories of his time with Abe. The two was sort of friends, closely associated, and he stated on the record that he misses Abe and he thought highly of him. And so not only is he looking to meet with a person who's from the Abe faction and who's maybe more politically closely aligned to Abe and perhaps himself, Trump, who's now sort of there as a sort of a potential alternate leader sitting within the LDP, an alternative to Ishiba, having narrowly lost that election to Ishiba, which sort of undermines his authority. He also met with Abe's widow, and you could say that's sort of a personal matter. It's on a friend basis because they had a pre-existing relationship meeting through Abe. But again, this raises the question of, is Trump using this to maybe undermine Ishiba, send a signal, put pressure on him? I think it's relatively probably not the case that he's looking to do this to install another leader or anything like that. It seems hard to imagine. But I think he's probably maybe sending a signal to Ishiba, putting a little bit of a pressure on. Maybe he's delaying this meeting and he's putting a little bit of this pressure on, as I say, to get more out of him, get certain trade concessions, security concessions, whatever it is Trump wants, and to sort of keep him on his toes. And given that from the Japan's perspective, the US alliance is such a key one with their troops stationed there, trade implications, security implications. Trump there has a lot of leverage, so maybe he's putting on a little bit of a pressure act and saying, don't take me for granted. I want certain concessions out, and maybe he's using figures from the Abe faction to sort of put a little bit of pressure on Ishiba in that respect. You've also seen this little bit of a back and forth if you look at Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister of the UK. If you look at what Elon Musk's been coming out with, a number of critical statements of towards Keir Starmer, calling for regime change in the UK, calling for a new leadership. And obviously Elon Musk very closely in line with Trump. You could maybe saw that as Donald Trump was sending a signal, possibly, if the two had communicated that. That's not known, obviously. It could have been just Elon Musk acting on his own. And so there was some speculation that perhaps Trump was critical of Starmer, but then it's recently come out that Trump said Starmer's doing a good job and, they had a great phone call and all this sort of thing. So maybe he's just sort of sending mixed signals to keep everyone on their toes. possibly it's a pattern, or maybe it's just a couple of coincidences in that case. But in any case, that revelation seems interesting timing that she's revealing it now, or maybe it just happened to come out in that interview. But it's interesting that that's come out now, and it just puts that little bit more pressure, I think, this story being circulated on Ishiba and his meeting with Trump. So we'll be interesting to see how that goes. Now, it looks like on the quiet, Ishiba and the LDP have suddenly increased their majority. Now, have they done that outside of an election season? That's quite a coup for them. Well, arguably the biggest story of last year was the Japan 2024 election, and after a long period of governance, it's essentially with only 2 brief periods, the LDP has been the majority party, or at least in government, since World War II, really. The LDP suddenly in the 2024 election suffered a number of losses. They had a big setback and they lost their election following a couple of scandals and change in leadership. And that was a big blow for Ishiba, it was a big blow for the LDP. But LDP have held on as a minority government, and they won in that election just on their own without any coalition partners, 191 seats. Now, I mentioned when I did sort of a look at the votes of who voted for Ishiba versus to remain as the minority leader, the prime minister, versus who voted for other parties, because there was that runoff election to decide who the Prime Minister of Japan would be, because there was no majority party, which in the end Ishiba won. I did a look at the tally count at the time of who voted for who, and it looked like some independents broke for Ishiba, was my speculation at the time. That looks to be confirmed because, quietly, 2 independent candidates have gone over to the LDP. They've changed their allegiance from being independents who won constituencies, and they're now affiliated with the LDP officially. And there's also been the reinstatement of 2 politicians, Hagyuda Koichi and Hirasawa Katsui. And I believe they were not official candidates to run in the election, but they ran anyway, because I think they were... this has a lot to do with the slush fund scandal, and which was a scandal affecting the LDP and obviously hurt them in the election. I believe they sort of lost their ticket. They were taken off the ballot as official LDP candidates, but won anyway. But following some testimony on the slush fund scandal, they've now been reinstated along with those 2 independents. And so the LDP, without an election, they've suddenly gone from 191 to 195. Now, obviously, you need 2 free seats to have a majority in the Japanese parliament, and they're still very much dependent on working with other parties there. So 191 to 195 doesn't sound like a big difference. You're still 38 seats short. You're still very much dependent on Komeito, who, and even they alone don't make up the gap. But I think this is significant. One, because of optics, purely optics, that it looks just looks a bit, even if effectively those independents were likely voting with you anyway, having them within the party banner a little bit within more in your control, and having the number be more solid and more known looks better on paper, and it just sends a message of more strength, more unity for the LDP party to have that higher number. And it also reduces, if there's another election, the risk of them losing their seats. Maybe they're a little bit more stable within the LDP banner. You can sort of, instead of the LDP having them run as sort of unaffiliated independents who are more vulnerable to a challenger, now they have the LDP name, and you know what you're voting for there. So it's a little bit more stability going forward. And also, I think there's maybe a danger as time goes on that independents over time will not be as reliable as full LDP members. There's a chance that if they feel exposed or vulnerable, or maybe they have words with other parties, they might be tempted to change their affiliation. Now, I don't know how realistic a prospect that is, but it seems a lot more stable to have them within the party banner. So I think there's quite a few advantages there for the LDP in having those come back. So that's a bit of good news for Ishiba in that respect, to have that increased minority status government having more members on. I think that's quite good for him, and it makes his government, in this time when there's a lot of negative news stories about him, he's having to hold on as minority government and constantly be working with other parties. It makes things a bit more stable. Now, we talked previously about the Japanese surname issue, which is that in Japan, when you get married, you have no choice but to adopt the one surname, shared surnames. And there's been discussions that now the LDP might be engaging in discussions to sort of reach a solution on that, move things forward, and possibly explore other options, which other parties have been pushing for as well, such as your choice of surnames, alternate surnames, something like that. And it's interesting because previously we talked about Tachi earlier, who lost to Ishiba in the election narrowly. She's perhaps been a little bit more on the right side of the LDP, and I remember hearing previously that she proposed a compromise of this, which was to stick with the tradition of only one surname, but to adopt nicknames as like an alternative basis. That, okay, perhaps on paper you have to have the same surname, marital surname, but perhaps you could use a nickname to get around it, so sort of a trading name. Just call yourself by an alternate name, or your previous name before you got married, as a way of getting around having to have a shared marital surname. That looks to be gaining perhaps favour, and I did say that this is a little bit of a tricky issue given the minority status of the LDP to get through, to consider, because there's a lot of pressure on their right and these new emerging right-wing parties. It might be difficult for Ishiba to just ignore the sort of traditionalist argument and go out and introduce a new change of a different surname status, and that looks to have come to pass because Ishiba's now apparently expressing the view that he might be looking at the option of introducing. He's looking at the option of the expansion of nicknames, effectively maiden names of women using their maiden name as a nickname, and perhaps making that more recognised. So it looks there like the prevailing winds of compromising might be what he's proposing there. He's maybe looking to avoid alienating his more core conservative base, and have people speak out in opposition to this, and sort of feeding into these Sanzito and the Conservative Party of Japan, giving them something to talk about, and also the difficulty possibly of getting this legislation through if some of his LDP members in the Diet aren't as keen on a sort of a full change in the system. So he looks like he's maybe going with a compromise there that won't upset the right as much, and maybe so there'll be legislation to make it a bit easier. Although maybe technically you'll have a shared marital surname, you'll be able to use your maiden name on forms or things like that, or you'll be able to register yourself for a business or something like that under your maiden name. That's just pure speculation on my part, but maybe there'll be a bit more of a compromise there to make that more widely used and to sort of encourage that use instead. And now, of course, obviously that's difficult for Ishiba because, yes, that might appease the right wing of his party. It might sort of stave off a challenge from these new emerging right wing parties, but that'll upset the opposition parties who are sort of more keen on a more permanent change, that he's perhaps not working with them, and it'll upset activists and people who generally want reform on this issue and see this as maybe him just avoiding a big fight and pandering to his conservative base. So it'd be interesting to see if he sticks with that and if this compromise is effective, if he gets anything through and done in that respect. But yeah, that looks like something he's considering, which perhaps would avoid a big fight over such a big shift on the surname issue. But we'll have to see how that goes. Now, there's been yet another update on Governor Saito. Just to give you a bit of a refresh, this is a very controversial Governor Saito. He's been in the news because effectively there was a big scandal where he was accused of accepting potentially gifts or encouraging businessmen to give him gifts and sort of accepting favours effectively while in his office as governor, and also he was also accused of bullying. And I believe investigations on that original accusation, which came out via a whistleblower, are still underway. But the assembly within the Hyogo province effectively pushed him out. They encouraged him to resign, I believe, or there was discussions of him resigning, but he said, no, I'm not resigning, I maintain I'm innocent. So the assembly voted. The assemblymen within Hyogo voted that he would be out, and this may cause a runoff election. And effectively he ran Saito a very sort of populist, or if you're critical of him, you'd maybe call it a post-truth campaign, where he was saying, I'm a victim here, there's an establishment or colluding against me, that I've done my best for you, the voters, and these allegations are all untrue. He had a big social media campaign with the anti-NHK party representative coming out for him very much and campaigning. And in the end, this seems to have been effective. He got voted back in. It was sort of seen as a big upset because he beat an opposition party where lots of candidates were colluding to try and get him out. But in the end, he won. It was seen as a big upset, a sort of Trumpian-style victory. Since that's happened, there's been another scandal where he was accused of improperly paying a campaign organisation to produce social media videos for him. He maintains he didn't do that, and he just paid them for signs and physical banners, which I believe is allowed within election law. So he maintains he's innocent on that charge, I believe. Since then, there's been more developments on this scandal. Tragically, there's been a further death, I believe. I believe one of the original deaths happened because the whistleblower that I believe first caused these allegations regarding bullying and abuse of power to come out, tragically committed suicide. That was a sort of a civil servant within the government. But this latest person who's died is one of the assemblymen who I believe was involved in the investigation against Saito. So you could generally say one of the people who was opposed to Saito, and now he's tragically turned up as dead as well. So another sad development in this story as this continues to go on, and it'll be interesting to see what eventually comes from any investigations and what happens to Governor Saito in this respect. But I believe he's now still in office and maintaining that he's innocent and he didn't commit these things he's accused of, and he's still in office. And as I say, we'll have to see what happens from there. So that hopefully rounds up a quick summary of the news within Japan in the politics world in the last week or so, in the last couple of weeks. I'd now like to move on to any other news, which is a little bit of a cultural controversy regarding the Ubisoft game and Assassin's Creed, the latest one set in Japan. Now, there's been a number of controversies and talk about in this online and back and forth on this. I don't want to get into that so much. It's more regarding the censorship of a YouTuber. I saw this making the rounds on Twitter that the YouTuber, again, apologies for any mispronunciations, Shohei Kondo, made a video essentially criticising the game, and I've watched it because since it was taken down, I believe hate speech was the reason cited. It's now been re-uploaded, and YouTube creators have apologised and reinstated the video. He's been allowed to re-upload it. I've watched it. It doesn't seem the worst thing by any means that I've seen on YouTube. I'm not quite sure why it was flagged for hate speech. Essentially, it was him criticising the graphics of the game, the running of the game, saying it seemed a bit under-designed and underdeveloped. I think he pointed out a few historical inaccuracies in the game, and generally he said, I think he criticised things like the graphics and how the game looked and things like that. I sort of don't quite see there why it was flagged as hate speech. The most thing that's most closing in on sort of a controversial topic was he was comparing the game to Resident Evil 5. I don't believe he even took a side on this. He just said, why is Resident Evil 5 seen as a little bit controversial and ineligible for a remake, or not, or seen as a little bit controversial, viewed as controversial? He didn't even say it was controversial. He said he just said it's viewed that way. He said, why is that it's seen as controversial, but this new Ubisoft game, Assassin's Creed, why is it not seen the same way? And he was just comparing the two. That's the closest thing I could see to sort of hot button issue. But again, I don't think, unless I misheard the video, I don't think he even took a side on that. He just compared the two and said, why is one okay and one not? But yeah, it seems strange that was taken down apparently 12 times for hate speech, when it mostly, as I've watched the video quickly, and it just seems to mostly be him critiquing the quality of it. But I think it's just perhaps YouTube was a bit vigilant because there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of controversial things said about this latest video game. Maybe he just caught up in that web, or there's been a lot of speculation also as to who might have reported it, but mostly it just seems critical of the game more than anything else. It's interesting because it seems to be a bit of a Barbra Streisand effect, because I'd never heard of this guy, and then suddenly I'm reading all over Twitter about how he's been taken down for censorship and criticising Ubisoft, and how YouTube have potentially censored him and then reinstated him. So I never would have heard of this if not for it being censored and taken down. So I wonder how many more people would have also seen it because of that, and whether that's put more attention on the issue and more attention on the controversy as well. So I just thought it was interesting in that respect that, again, it's just an example of the Barbra Streisand effect, more eyes on this, more controversy because of attempted censorship, which was then recanted by YouTube. But yeah, that just about sums up the news, guys. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Sayonara, goodbye.